Today we are in the east end of Glasgow, in the Archdiocese of Glasgow, in a parish called St. Paul's, Shettleston, dedicated to St. Paul the Apostle. We are here to see Father David Brown, and we are here to interview him and to talk to him about his vocation and his journey. Hello, and thank you for giving us this time this afternoon. Could you just introduce yourself and tell the audience from where you come from?
Sure, Paddy. Well, we're in Glasgow in Scotland. We're privileged to be here. And I've been your parish priest here in St. Paul's for 3.5 years and enjoyed every minute of it.
Oh,
so the vocation, the vocation is a happy one. So we never grow tired. And I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you. Yeah.
So this is a stage in the journey. You were brought up in a Catholic family. Could you tell us something about your childhood and your first experiences of church and Jesus?
My family background, very happy. A background where in my family, my mother was a very devout Catholic. My father wasn't Catholic, but we grew up in a home where there was great respect for faith, and my brother and sister who came along later, the 5 of us, we were a very happy family, and the church very much part of our life. We lived in a little village only 10 miles from Glasgow, but in those days 10 miles could have been 10,000 miles. It was a little community where everyone knew one another and where the church was very much at the centre of that community. And the school, the parish, the local community, a very supportive kind of community, and one where people looked after one another.
Yeah, that sounds really idyllic here.
It was really, yeah.
Yeah, it's not the same these days. There's not a great sense of community, is there?
I don't think the same sense of community exists nowadays in many places. In the little community where I grew up, there were a great deal of interrelations, cousins, uncles, aunts. You know, it was a place where there were a number of families, but the families were big families and many connections. Yeah. And I used to think, growing up as a wee boy, that I was in some way in an Italian village because everyone I knew seemed to have a middle name which sounded very Italian, and it was Maridonti. You know, Mary Maridonti, Willie Miller, you know, that kind of, everybody spoke about the relationships. When they gave you your name, you gave the whole family history almost, and the Maridonti, married to somebody, you know. But a good community, yes.
Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but you know, if you think back to your childhood, were there any signs that you felt that you might end up making a choice for the priesthood?
The desire for the priesthood was something which I didn't express for a long time. I told about my intentions, in a sense, by accident. At school, we had all been asked to write an essay on what we would like to do with our lives after we left school. And I wrote in my book that I would like to be a priest. And I had never expressed that to anyone before. And when the books were being handed back to the pupils in the classroom, I didn't get my book back. The teacher said, "I've given it to the priest." And then the priest came up to the house and said, "I see you want to become a priest." And before I knew where I was, I had an arrangement to go and see the Archbishop, to be interviewed and to sit an entrance exam for the seminary. And it was all very much a whirlwind.
So how old were you when this happened?
That was, I would be 12 years of age and going into the junior seminary, leaving the primary school. But the interesting thing was, although I hadn't really expressed, even to my parents, an intention for the priesthood, I had visited an exhibition in Glasgow the previous year on the work of the church, where missionary orders had set up for a whole week to display their various apostolates. And with some of my friends from school, we had gone to this exhibition. And when I was expressing my desire in this essay to become a priest, 3 others were doing the same. And 2 of us went on to study for the diocesan priesthood, and 2 went on to study for the missionary orders in the church, all at the same time. So once we had expressed the intention, we discovered others had the same intention, and we get great support from one another. And
so you went up then to Blair's at a very early age?
I went to, yes, a place in Langbank, a college, St Vincent's College in Langbank for 2 years, and then to Blair's College in Aberdeen for another 4 years, and then for 6 years to the senior seminary, the interdiocesan seminary at St Peter's College in Cardross. The interesting thing for me was, when I look back, I see how I was influenced by so much that was going on in the world at that time. I was born just in the middle of the century, in which in the previous half century there had been 2 world wars, and the world was awakening to this notion that we want a better future. Let's build a better future together. And at the same time as that intention was happening, as I was growing up, and we had the ban the bomb demonstrations and everything else, we had the satellite television was only beginning, so we were becoming aware of other parts of the world. The world was becoming a global village. Air travel was beginning, the jet aeroplane, later the development of Concorde and the space race. There was a huge explosion in a reach out to the whole world, where we became aware of the wider world, and where through the media again, I was aware of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. I was aware of Martin Luther King in the United States. I was brought up with the music of Pete Seeger and Joan Baez and the freedom songs and the struggle for a better world. And while I was thinking about the priesthood and preparing for the priesthood, there were so many other people whose career was taking them down the same line of saying, I want to make the world and leave the world a better place than I found it. You know, so there was a great kind of enthusiasm to do something with your life. And at the very same time that I was starting in the seminary, the Second Vatican Council was starting, and the church was entering into dialogue with the world as well. The reach out, the opening of the windows of the church. So it was an exciting time. I think it was Pope Paul VI, in a great document on evangelization, who said, you don't evangelize by changing people, you evangelize by changing culture, and you open up new possibilities. So that was part of the upbringing I had, this reach out to the world, this reach out with your faith to share something with society. And if people ask me, why did you become a priest? I would have to say, and I often have said, I knew the priests in my parish. They seemed happy in what they did, and I wanted to be as happy as they were. And it was as simple as that.
This is really inspiring, because we were talking earlier, and very often the vision is of giving something up. You're talking about joining something.
Yes.
Getting into something, which just sounds wonderful.
Well, it is, because, you know, again, when I was growing up, people joined things. They don't join things today. They're more likely to be sitting in the house looking at a computer or whatever. I was out every evening. If I wasn't playing football, I was in the Scouts. If I wasn't at the Scouts, I was at the swimming, you know. There was an outreach and joining things, you know, belonging, developing talents, and above all, I suppose, being with people, you know. And it was a great encouragement in the kind of society in which I grew up. The source of support, if you like, was being with other people who had the same aim in life. You know, when I started in the junior seminary, we started with 63 people starting on the same day.
Same year.
The same year. And of those 63, only 9 became priests. So there were many other people who didn't go on to the priesthood, but they still supported me. They still, for the time they were there and when they thought they might have a vocation to the priesthood, they were very supportive. And, you know, I would like to say it was all very supportive in spiritual matters. It could be equally important to be supported in playing football or taking part in other sports, you know, that sense of belonging. And then when in the process of the 12 years in the seminary, although I was away from my family for most of the time, we grew very close. We go home Christmas, well, when I say we go home at Christmas, we go home after Christmas. Nobody in the seminary could understand why you would want to be home with your family at Christmas when you could stay in the college and watch Tom and Jerry cartoons in the college theatre, you know. We didn't get home for Christmas, you know. In fact, I remember it was in my first year in the senior seminary, and my father had written to me to say that he had decided to become a Catholic. He didn't at that point tell my mother. He was taking instruction privately, was secretly, if you like. But he wrote to me and told me, and he asked me to become his sponsor or godparent at his baptism. And he was to be baptized on the 23rd of December. And then at the following evening at Christmas midnight mass, he would make his first Holy Communion. And I had to get permission to come home from the seminary to be his sponsor at baptism. And I had to come straight back. I wasn't allowed to stay even for his first communion at Christmas midnight mass. I had to go back to the seminary to watch the cartoons. But I remember leaving the rector's room, having had to put in a strong plea to get home to do such a thing as to be my father's baptismal sponsor. And the rector saying to me as I left his room, he said, "Now don't be making a habit of this. You know, how you make a habit of being the sponsor of your father at his baptism." But so we did get home, but it was only really Christmas and for a week at Easter and then for the summer holidays. But even in the seminary, we had this desire to be part of a better world, you know,
and to change things.
To change things, you know.
And this is really wonderful to experience that. I think quite often out there's a vision that, you know, these men or these young boys went on and they were holy ever after, you know.
Oh, yeah.
They left the world and they weren't engaged. Are you telling us a different story?
Well, I'm telling you a different story because our desire was still very much to be part of this change in society, and yet, you know, the seminary system was struggling to change. When I entered the seminary, it was 1963, the Second Vatican Council was only starting. And I remember the Archbishop at the time saying to me at the interview, he said, "You're going to a seminary, and the seminary is out in the country. You won't have any access to television or newspapers. You'll be kept away from the world so that after 12 years, you'll become holy and you can be a good priest." And of the 3 seminaries I was in, they all closed down because of the change in the attitude of the church, that you don't become holy by withdrawing from the world. You become holy by being in the world. The mission of the church is to be in the world. Jesus said to the disciples, "Go out into the whole world." He didn't say withdraw from the world. Yeah. But that realization came during my time in the seminary. So the whole seminary system changed to become much more open and much more aware of the needs. And so the preparations for the priesthood very much changed over the time I was studying. Yeah. I must honestly say that during the whole time in the seminary, I was supported in trying to do what I felt I wanted to do. Although every time I came home on holiday, my mother, remember, she was the Catholic one.
Oh, yes.
In the early days. She would always say, "You don't have to go back to the seminary if you don't want to." She was reluctant to lose her eldest son in those early days. My father was much more supportive. You know, if you want to do this, you do it. So, but I can say there were no doubts, really. I did a lot of thinking, I did a lot of praying about it, and I did a lot of talking. I've spoken of the support of fellow students throughout the seminary, and all the teachers we had, both junior and secondary, junior and senior seminary, were all priests, you know, and they were inspirational figures too, you know, because you were saying, I want to be like them. They were very encouraging. They were good examples of priesthood. And when I look back, those seminary staff must have been frustrated because they would rather have been in parishes, working in parishes with people who may not have wanted to be in the seminary, but they still were inspiring characters in many different ways.
Did you develop any particular devotion to a saint or to a particular aspect of the church that's just kept with you?
My favourite saint was always St. Joseph. He was my patron saint at confirmation. The cynics would say that, you know, the thing about St. Joseph is that nothing ever happened to him when he was awake. All the good things happened to him when he was asleep. But that was not why I was inspired by Joseph. But I always thought he was a good example of how just by getting on with the job quietly, you can achieve so much. So Joseph would be my patron saint, if you like. The inspiration from other characters in the church, the different popes, John the 23rd, when I entered the seminary, and then, you know, all of the time in the seminary, really, Pope Paul VI, who I think is very underrated in what, you know, he was a saintly figure. He agonized over the church and the changes to find the continuity, and he had to hold the tide against those who wanted not to move at all and those who wanted to move more quickly, and you know, but he was a great inspiration to me. And I remember in the junior seminary reading, and have reread so often since to deepen my understanding of it, his initial document, which was called Ecclesiam Suam, which was his manifesto, if you like, of his ministry. And he spoke of the key word of dialogue. And he had a beautiful passage where he spoke of the circles of dialogue, the dialogue between God and humanity in Revelation, dialogue of human beings with God in prayer, dialogue in Scripture, dialogue within the church and co-responsibility, dialogue with other Christians, dialogue with other religions, dialogue with people of no religion. You know, there was a beautiful circle of dialogue, you know. It was his key word, you know.
Absolutely,
yeah. And the thing about, you know, as well, I always felt about the church, the analogy of the bark of Peter. You know, a sailing ship doesn't go straight through the water. It tacks from side to side, you know, as it catches, you know. So you always veer one way and then you come back. And how the various popes in the history of the church all had a particular emphasis, you know. And Paul VI was dialogue. He took you this way. And then John Paul was about authority, and, you know, he would take you the other way, and, you know, but always with a view to the centre.
I haven't heard this one again. Is it the bark of?
The bark of Peter, the sailing ship, you know, that you don't sail straight through the water, you go from tack to, you know, you move from side to side, always with a view to the middle.
That's a lovely vision of the
church.
church.
It's a thing I've always, you know, felt that the church has always had the inspirational people at the helm, if you like, of this bark, you know. Not that they contradict one another, but they all have their different emphasis. And, you know, if Paul VI was for dialogue with people outside the church, John Paul very much with building up the unity of the church and the common mind of the church, if you like, you know, and orthodoxy, and you know, in that sense. I remember Thomas Winning had just been appointed Archbishop of Glasgow, and he wanted to have a big ordination ceremony in the seminary, ordaining all the priests together on the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. I wasn't keen to do that. I didn't want to be part of that. I would rather have been ordained in my home parish, because it was the second oldest parish in the Archdiocese of Glasgow, and there hadn't been an ordination ever in the history of that parish. And I remember pleading with the Archbishop to allow me to be ordained in my home parish. And eventually he said, I'll agree to that. He said, the others will be ordained in the feast of St. Peter and Paul, "You'll be done on the Feast of St. Thomas," because he always wanted to be different.
Which has a lot of resonances with what we're doing today.
And he was, he came to my home parish and for the ordination, and it was an occasion for the whole village to turn out. And the interesting thing was that when I entered the junior seminary in 1963, there hadn't been an ordination of anyone from the parish for 40 odd years. But at my ordination mass, there were 7 altar servers assisting the Archbishop at the ordination, and all 7 were parishioners and all 7 were in seminaries. Amazing. So, you know, it was the kind of feeling that if 1 or 2 take a step forward, others will follow, you know. Which is why, you know, even in vocation terms, I don't think that I was called as an individual. I had a personal invitation, but I wasn't an individual in the sense that 3 of my classmates in school heard the same call and entered different seminaries. We kept contact with one another. People responding to the vocation don't only respond as individuals, they support one another in the response.
Come as a team, yeah.
And it's very important, I think, to recognise that the vocations are people called from a community, but they respond from a community with the support of the community, whether it's with other seminarians, whether it's with the prayers and the support in so many different ways of the local community. But we don't respond just for ourselves or by ourselves. We respond very much as someone who's called into relationship with the church, and we respond together. In the early days in my priesthood, I would be in a parish with another 3 or 4 priests. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been the only priest in a parish. The difference in the change has been that in the early days, my partnership was with other priests. Nowadays, my partnership is with the people. You know, and in the early days of my priesthood, the priest did things for the people. Now the priest does things with the people. And, you know, the opportunity for lay people to become involved, you know, the liturgical ministries are only one example of that. There were no Eucharistic ministers in my early priesthood. The idea of a lay reader was only just beginning. There were no administrators in the church. But more importantly than that, the involvement of lay people in the church today, living out their vocation through baptism. And remember, this is one of the great things about the Second Vatican Council, that sharing the mission of Jesus does not come from the office we hold within the church, it comes from our baptism. And when I take part in receiving adults into the church, baptizing at Easter, I can say that in every one of those people, they didn't meet me in the first instance in order to decide to join the church. They were led into the church by the example of other lay people, and they met me once they came in. But the lay people are very much in the forefront of the mission of the church in commerce, in industry, in politics, in public life, in education. It's the lay people who inspire people today, just as they inspired me. It was lay people who inspired me.
Inspired you, your family and everything. Yeah.
Everything, yeah. So the change over the 43 years of my life as a priest has been this sharing of responsibility and working in partnership with other people, lay people of various particular vocations within the church. Having said that, I still, every Friday, meet for lunch with some of the priests with whom I was ordained. We meet every week, just for an hour, to support one another, because that's very important, because there are things we can talk about.
These are lifelong friendships, really. Lifelong friendships. Bonds that we're...
and we're very supportive. And if ever we have any anxieties, we come together and we support one another, and we try to find strength from that support with one another. So,
absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing some of that with us. I think it'll be very inspirational for young men to feel, especially the thing, and correct me if I'm wrong in saying, you're talking about joining something rather than giving up something.
Yes.
And
yes.
that vision is just marvelous. Thank you.
Thank you, Paddy.
You've been my parish priest for 3.5 years, and I didn't know some of those things.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I'm Bishop David McGough, an auxiliary bishop here in this archdiocese. I'm just so delighted through yourselves, Christian faith will have a voice. And you're here today giving voice to that media. The greatest gift that any of us has is the gift of life itself. We struggle throughout our lives to live life to the full, and we sometimes mess it up, but that life is so precious. And it is God's gift to each one of us from the very first moment of conception to the last moment of our lives, to be cherished, to be loved, to be safeguarded. So God bless you all.
Shalom World, God's own channel.